Have governments get out of the way and individuals make choices of their own, choices adjusted to their own risks and risk tolerance, not a mindless one-size-fits-all solution that takes very little account of people's real lives. We need some restitution for the young and their broken dreams, for the poor and their lost sustenance, and for the rest of us and our lost liberties. There's one perspective. Another perspective, in addition to the lockdowns that are being pursued, is to expand them to contemplate other transformations that have been delayed too long. And for that, I give you the commentary of Mariana Mazzucato, who is a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London. We have triple crisis here, obviously the pandemic, but we also have a crisis in climate. That's a public health crisis. And addressing it requires reorienting corporate governance, finance, policy, and energy systems towards a green economic transformation. 3 obstacles must be removed. Business that is shareholder-driven instead of stakeholder-driven. It'll be interesting. So that'll be an interesting board meeting when it's announced that Business A is moving to not consider shareholder return, but stockholder psyche. Stakeholder psyche. Finance that is used in inadequate and inappropriate ways, and government that is based on outdated economic thinking and faulty assumptions. Corporate governance must now reflect stakeholders' needs instead of shareholders' whims. Building an inclusive, sustainable economy depends on productive cooperation among the public and private sectors and civil society. This means firms listen to trade unions and workers' collectives, community groups, consumer advocates, and unnamed others, according to the professor. This also means that if we don't act boldly in the direction that she suggests, then we'll have to impose economy-wide lockdowns to halt climate change, which, as we know from last night's debate, is an existential threat. That's what Kamala Harris said. That's how the Harris, Biden, Bernie Sanders Green New Deal plans tackle it.
So when we're over COVID, then we're going to go back to climate change crisis. Or are they going to go, run parallel to each other?
Yeah, you've established a precedent. We locked down in a public health crisis. So now the challenge is just to define things as public health crises, and then you can pursue the same approach to one public health crisis, be a pandemic, or another public health crisis, according to them, which would be global warming or climate change. Then they've updated it since there has been a reduction in warming as compared to predictions. So that to me is a close approximation of the choice in terms of economic thinking, in terms of thinking on economic freedom on a go-forward basis. For more on this, pleased to be joined by John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks, and author of The End of Work: Why Your Passion Can Become Your Job. Well, unless the government locks you out of your passion. John, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Your takeaways from the debate, particularly on, less so on the more fleeting topic of taxes, although that's a real issue, more so on the big gambits. And this is the discussion on environmentalism that was had last night, as it was to some extent had last week in the presidential debate.
Yeah, well, my question is always, aren't voters skeptical at this point about politicians promising crisis? This would come from either side. We've heard for how many decades that the world's on the verge of, the 80 largest cities in the world are on the verge of being basically flooded by water because we haven't fought this alleged climate crisis. Why is it then that half of the world's population lives in coastal cities? Is that just a dumb market? Is half of the world just a really stupid market? Why do most businesses populate near in coastal cities? Are they just stupid? Do they not care about their houses and their buildings that will be wiped away by this climate crisis? I mean, I think it would help if our side eventually said, made the market argument that if this were such a thing, why aren't markets crashing to reflect the fact that most global wealth is in the very places where global warming is supposed to wipe us out?
Well, and I mean, why are markets crashing right now? One response from the Keynesian crowd would be, well, thanks to those government interventions, whether it be the $4 trillion worth of easy money or the couple $3 trillion worth of COVID relief.
Yeah, well, there's no such thing as either. There's a New York Times front page story today about the economy will collapse without stimulus. And so, well, the obvious answer is that without an economy, there is no stimulus. When governments spend money, they're spending growth that already occurred. They're harvesting growth that already happened. That's why they have money to spend. And so this idea that you can stimulate economic growth and trick markets by basically moving money from one pocket to another defies basic common sense. And that gets to the heart. If you want to know what I think about last night's debate and all these debates, when are Republicans going to say we demand one debate where we have someone who would ask the questions that we would ask? Mm-hmm. As in, ask, how is it that government spending works if you're taking it from one set of hands from the other? Did the growth already occur? How is it that the Fed, just by fiddling with rates, could somehow cause credit to surge? All these questions that we ask, but that the allegedly right-wing Fox never asks. And so you basically have 3 debates every time, and then 4th if you had the vice president, where the Republican is on the defensive because they ask questions from the left-wing point of view. Wouldn't it be wise for Republicans to say we're going to have someone with a clue about economics to maybe moderate one of the debates?
No question about it. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that there's anybody in the D.C. press corps that fits that description, so they'll have to think a little bit more broadly, maybe take somebody out of academia or some other walk of life that has as much capacity.
How about Mary O'Grady from the Wall Street Journal? I could name you a bunch of people from the Wall.
Okay.
I'll take Paul Gigot. There's a long list of people from credible media who could ask the questions that we might ask. But Republicans every time hand the debate question over to the Democrats by saying we're going to answer questions through your highly emotional filter about how the world is ending, how everyone's starving, how kids are going without meals. Well, how do you win? Look, the debates are ridiculous in the first place, but how do you win such a discussion when you're always asking questions from people who go to bed at night with their thumbs in their mouth, sucking them just vociferously?
Well, it seems to me, there actually is a way to do it that could actually have a compound effect, which is to attack the premise of the question when you get a silly question from a Susan Page or from a Chris Wallace that starts from the premise of the left. Unfortunately, to your point, sometimes it takes more than 90 seconds to break it down. But there was a moment last night, and I know Pence didn't want to go there because it was on a topic he doesn't want to spend a lot of time on, Trump's taxes, but where Kamala Harris said Trump has, according to the New York Times, $400,000 in debts or something like this. And she says, let me explain what a debt is. A debt is when you owe somebody money. And so who is this person? And is he making decisions based on the people he owes money to or something else? Just
people have mortgages.
The silly conspiracy theorizing because she doesn't know what she's talking about. But a fun rejoinder would have been, oh, really? Debt is when you owe somebody else money. So when we have, for example, $20 trillion plus in debt, $25 trillion in debt now, $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. That's money that we owe or we're imposing on people who will owe future generations of Americans. So let's talk about spending, although this administration is not exactly in the strongest position to talk about it. But it just would be nice when they talk about these matters at a personal level and somehow they're not applicable at a public policy level, I guess is my larger point.
Yeah. Again, they never know the right questions to ask, particularly ones on economics, and it's just it's frustrating that Republicans haven't picked up on this. And
the exchange on China. I mean, I know you're a free trader, but the idea that the trade war has been lost, manufacturing jobs have cratered. I mean, I'm not a proponent of tariffs either. I'm a free trader, but I thought Mike Pence was effective when he said, the trade war is lost. I mean, Joe Biden never even fought it. There is something that we've learned about China through their myriad human rights abuses, plus the intellectual piracy, plus the culpability they have with the spread of the COVID-19 virus. That does suggest a long overdue reckoning, even if it's not always taken the form that a free marketeer like you would otherwise appreciate.
Well, my response will always be, so because the Chinese have done some things that some who aren't free traders don't like, should we damage the American people? Mm-hmm. I mean, my frustration just with the virus question alone is from our side, we get people on our side who properly point out all the time just how very much this hits a tiny sliver of the population. As the New York Times regularly points out, over 40% of the deaths happen among people in nursing homes. It's not that the old people dying isn't sad, but it's rarely, if ever, a tragedy. A tragedy is when hundreds of millions around the world are starving as a consequence of the virus. And so I ask the question, if we're going to point out these things, how can we then say, well, but the Chinese gave us the virus? If that's the best they can do, they can create something that has a death toll of 200,000 where by some accounts, a high majority of that 200,000 were people dying with the virus, among other things. What are we so angry about? I don't get the whole China thing. And again, Biden is of course plagiarizing the Trump administration's illiteracy on trade. The reality, I thought we were for foreign policy and for global safety and everything. When countries trade together, war is much less likely. To me, China was a much bigger threat 40 years ago when it was an impoverished country. Now we have a rooting interest in one another, but both sides seem to want to fritter it away. I don't get it.
Do you not think China should pay for what they did with either releasing or letting this go, lacking to talk about coronavirus for 6 weeks before letting the world know what happened?
What would you talk about? How could you talk about something? Let's be clear. China's got the most iPhone dense or smartphone dense country in the world. If it had been a major killer, we would have known in November and December that it was a major killer. So what would you talk about? And ask yourself the question, what if it sprouts up in Wichita? Would Americans, at this point, something that really doesn't seem to affect most people? I mean, it's been spreading around the world for months without any response from global governments, and there was no surge in deaths or anything, no surge in sickness. And so what if Americans suddenly said, oh, well, it's sprung up in Wichita, so let's lock down the whole U.S. economy to save the rest of the world? And why would we do that? I mean, what would be the idea behind that, locking down based on something with incredibly low lethality rates?
Well,
President Trump is the most protected person in the world. If you want to meet with him, you have to be tested for the virus.
And he even got the virus.
So he gets it. So somehow the American people who value their freedom more than any other, thank goodness, we are going to somehow limit the virus to the United States, unlike those dastardly Chinese who spread something to the rest of the world. I mean, let's try to be serious about this.
Well, I mean, there's the lockdown policies in response, sort of the knee-jerk reaction that we took. That's certainly up for review. But I mean, with respect to China, there's a lot of stuff we don't know. I mean, there's a virologist that has come forward, and she has sought and received refuge in the United States, who suggested that the virus was created in a lab, was weaponized in a lab, and was released on purpose. So we don't know the origins of this so far. But if what she is saying turns out to be true, that is a completely different thing than a virus naturally occurring and a government being unable to stop the spread of it.
Okay, but let's assume that conspiracy theory actually turns out to be true. We would then say, wow, gosh, they're not nearly as effective as we thought. That's the best you can do. You don't
think they were effective? We have thousands of people who have lost tens of thousands, millions of people who have lost their jobs and their lives and their livelihoods, and quite frankly, their minds too. Over this.
And
they
won. Lost it. Did the Chinese cause that, or did American politicians panic? I mean, let's ask the question, who on earth, when in history have politicians in response to a virus said the answer is to wreck the economy? when economic growth has always been the biggest enemy of illness and disease, when economic growth has always elongated life, the response was to wreck the economy, and we're going to blame the Chinese for that. How about we take responsibility? So why are Republicans increasingly such victims? Oh, the Chinese did it for us. No, don't lock down the economy, and you don't have a problem.
Yeah.
The only one who did it right was Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, there is the argument to be made. I mean, of course, the Trump administration is not going to make it because they're going to, and the experts lean on the politicians and the politicians lean on the experts, and they sort of cover one another. I get it. But there's certainly an argument to be made. It just can't be made in this context, or it's not going to be. It could be, but it's not going to be. That, we didn't know so much in the beginning. It should have been ease in, just as we're trying to ease out, and some states are doing it effectively, Florida, and other states are not, Illinois, New York, California. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an absolutely fair point, and it speaks to the limitation of politics, which I know you will say, and I will agree, that speaks to the need to always limit the political power of politicians, right?
Yeah, without question. The crisis was never a virus. Please, I mean, can we be for once be honest? Assuming they'd never discovered it, do you think anyone would have noticed? Has the U.S. changed? Have we lost a major part of the population as a consequence of this spreading? What if it had spread in 1950? Do you think we would have been talking about it?
We would have never known about it. Even in the 80s, we would have never known because the internet wasn't around, and YouTube, and all this fast information right away that you get.
Even in 2000, and because it's not to knock old people, but there is a greater tendency when they're older for them to pass, particularly if they're in nursing homes, and so it would never have come up. And so let's stop excusing politicians. And the response is, well, the media wouldn't support us. At what point do Republicans recognize that Ronald Reagan had much less media? He had the whole, back then it was the New York Times, LA Times, Post, and Wall Street Journal, and PBS setting the news agenda. There wasn't your show, there wasn't Rush Limbaugh, there wasn't the internet. Ronald Reagan had it all against him, and yet he still managed to win 49 states to 1. Why can't Republicans just occasionally act like Republicans and say, you know what? We're not going to take away freedom from people in response to a virus, and we're certainly not going to take away their ability to prosper in response to a virus, because that, assuming it is as risky as we think, the best way to fight something like that is economic growth. So I'm sick of excusing politicians. This is what they always do.
He is John Tamny, editor of RealClearMarket's.com, director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks, author of The End of Work, Why Your Passion Can Become Your Job. John, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And we have confirmed the second presidential debate will be virtual. This is what's going to happen. They're going to have the moderator and the town hall participants at the Performing Arts Center in Miami, and the two presidential candidates, or President Trump and Biden, will be participating from separate remote locations.
That's ridiculous.
I know.
Totally ridiculous.
It's news, opinion, insight. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
It may not be stomach issues.
For me, it's intense gas, or pain, or diarrhea, sometimes all at once, over and over.
I spent